In today's lecture, we'll be working with different controls on our forms, as well as learning how each control has a number of properties that determine its appearance and its behavior. In addition to that, we'll be seeing how through the code in C# you can access these controls and change some of those properties so that when a button is clicked or when a form starts up for the first time, you'll be able to change those and see a change on the form as well as a result of that. Now, occasionally, we'll be starting off with some code that we worked on the previous lecture, or maybe I'll have some code put together so that we can get a faster start right off the bat. If that is the case, that code will be available out on github.com. What GitHub is an online source code repository and version control system. What that means is that I upload my code out to the cloud, out to the internet, and it's freely available to anybody. I'll include a link at the end of this video. Once you get to that link, it will take you to this page. This page here has a repository. That's how code is organized for the Intro to C# online class. If you go to the link in the middle of the page, you'll see that there's a zip, and if you were to click that, it will download all the code from class. Opening up the zip file and going into the folders, you'll see that there will be a folder corresponding to the day the lecture was recorded, and inside that folder, any code that was either completed as a result of that lecture or as a starting point. Today we'll be going off of this hello world as a starting point, and that was the code that we finished up from the last lecture. Additionally, on the website, you'll see that the same file structure exists as what was downloaded from the zip file. If I click into this folder, and now I click into this hello world folder as well, you'll see that we have that familiar structure. We have hello world solution.sln, that's our solution file, and the hello world project. Going in here, we see the different individual files that make up our project. And if you were to click on any one of these, you'll see the same code that we worked on in class, and you can view it in your browser. This will also work from any mobile phone or tablet device as well. So it's a good tool to be able to study up on. Perhaps if you're not in front of a computer, this can give you a different perspective since you can't really interact with it, but you can see that this is the code that we've worked on. If you have any additional questions about GitHub, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so I have this code downloaded already, and I have the solution open. To open up my form, I double-click FRM Hello World, and that brings up the form that we were working on. Now, this is really the first time that we've worked with interacting with the visual appearance of our controls. And this form here is also a control. It's anything that the user can interact with and has certain properties such as this text here or size in Visual Studio as a control. And you'll see that once you've selected it, it has these little squares in the middle of each line and at the corners. And what these are called handles. Anytime you see a handle on a control, that means that it can be resized. And if you put your mouse over the handle, you'll see that the cursor will change from the pointer to a left and right arrow. That means that I can drag this side left and right. Like letting go of it will resize my form. I can take the same one and go back. If I go after the handle on the bottom, my arrow changes from up and down. And now I can resize it vertically. The handle on the corner will change into a diagonal arrow, and I can do both at the same time. I'm going to resize my control to make it a little wider and a little taller. And now I would like to put a label onto my form. A label is used to display a piece of text to the user. Mousing over the sidebar where it says Toolbox, and you may get an empty box at first, and it will say there are no controls usable for this context. And what that means, and I'll give it a little bit, but it may take a little bit to load. If you don't see that, for example, if we had our form closed down, It could be that you don't have your form open or you're not selected on it. We say a lot of menus inside of Visual Studio are context sensitive. Context meaning what you're doing at the time. If you're not working with your form, then there are no controls because you're not in your form to work with. So going here, double clicking on my form again, mousing over to my toolbox, and scrolling down, I'm going to pick the one that is called Label. I'm going to left click, hold on to that mouse button, and I'm going to drag it over. And you can see that the cursor changes to sort of that circle with the line through it. Usually we associate that with no, or something that you can't do. And you'll notice once you drag it over to your form, it will change into a plus with a little square by it. That means that once you let go, that will add that label to your form. It's now part of your form. And if we were to launch our application by pressing F5, you'll see that our form now has the text Label 1 on it. Label 1 is the default name that Visual Studio will give this label because we didn't tell it anything different. If I were to go into my toolbox again, hold that down, drag it onto my form, and let go, it's going to name the next one Label 2. And pressing F5, I will see that now I'm seeing both of these on my form. But this isn't really what we want. We wouldn't say that this is very user-friendly to what it is that we want to do. Now, to select the label, to work with it, you'll see that if you put your mouse over the label, it will change it into the crosshairs. Holding that down will let you move your label wherever you want. Letting go, and at its new position. Same with this. Now, I only want one label on my form right now. So I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to press my delete key. That will delete the label and no longer will keep it on my form. Now I want to change this label to something a little more friendly to the user. So to do so, I have to kind of talk about what a label is and what it really means to what we're doing and how it ties into programming. And what that is everything that you see on your form right now is considered an object. And objects are very special things when it comes to computer programming. Objects are things that are able to have characteristics. They're able to have traits. We say they have properties. One label, and if I were to drag a second one on, is a completely different object from another label. And it's easy for us to see this right now because this one says Label 1 and this one says Label 2. But they are independent of each other. If I were to move this label, it doesn't affect this one. This one has a certain location on the form that's completely different and unique from the second label. When I change the properties of one, it will not affect the other. That is because they are two separate objects. Objects have a type. In this case, both of these objects are of a type label. Labels have certain properties that make them special according to other controls, like a button or a text box. But we're interested in labels right now. Specifically, we're interested in what the label says. We would say that this one has text of Label 1. Text is a property of the label. And that is what we want to change. So I'm going to select this label. I'm going to right click on the label and I'm going to go all the way to the bottom where it says Properties. And what that will do in the lower right hand side of your Visual Studio is it will open up the Properties window. And by default, the first time, it's going to highlight the text property. That's because when it comes to labels, the text property is the most common property that you're going to be using. The left-hand side of this column is the name of the property. The right-hand side is the value. Clicking into that will allow me to edit the property. Hitting backspace, just like you would fill out any other kind of form. I'm going to type the words Hello World. Once done, I can click off into another property, I can click off into my screen, or I can hit the Enter key. And you'll notice once I do, the text on that label has now changed to Hello World. Again, I'm going to leave this one here to show you that I changed the text property on this label and it did not affect this one at all. Both of them are unique objects and have independent text properties from each other. Now when I hit F5, my application says Hello World. And so we've worked on our first property and an object inside of Visual Studio and C#. Traditionally, when you write your first program in any different programming language, the first one you write is an application that says the word Hello World. Once you do that, you're officially a programmer. Okay, this is still a little boring though, and I think we can make this look a lot nicer than it's looking right now. For one, it's very small. There are additional properties. In case you didn't notice, there are a lot of properties over here. You'll see there's a scroll bar on the side, and we can scroll all the way up and down, and you'll see there are just tons of them. And there are some properties in here that we won't ever use, but there are some that we're going to use a lot. Now, yours may not be organized by mine. By default, I think that this button here is clicked, and it organizes them over by category. And you'll see they're grouped as accessibility, appearance, and you can scroll down and see for yourself. I like to do this little button over here called A to Z. And what that does is it will alphabetize all the properties that are available. So we use text, but what I'm interested in is I want to make it bigger. Now if we were in Microsoft Word, I think all of us would say, well yeah, you got to change the font. And that's exactly what it is here. And you'll see there's that triangle, the grayed out triangle next to it. That means there's more options. I'm going to click that and it expands that out. And you can change the font type, the size, if it's bold or not, if it's italic, if it's got a strikeout, or if it's underlined. Quite a few options. I'm going to click into size, and I'm going to type in 14 and hit enter. And now we have our word. It's quite a bit bigger. And why not make it bold as well? Bold is sort of an on or off property. We'd say it's a Boolean, and that's something that we'll learn about in a little bit. But in this case, a Boolean, we say on or off. In programming, it's true or false. And you'll notice when I did that, my font became bold again. Now, still, we have this old label right here, and that one is still its old font that we didn't do anything with. So let's practice and do that one as well. You'll notice over here, as I select a different label, the properties change. We know that we changed the first one, the font size to 14, and the bold to true. And I click in here, it goes back down to 8.25, and bold is false. That's, again, because they each have distinct and unique properties, independent from each other. But I'm going to change this one now to 14, and I'm going to change the bold to true. It's not saying anything interesting. It's still saying label 2, but now it's bold and it's bigger. I can work with multiple controls at the same time, especially if they are of the same type. Remember, I said these are two objects that both have the type label. I can select this one, hold down my Shift key, and if they are the same type, there are some properties that I can go in and I can change both of them at the same time. Let's say I decided that I didn't want it to be bold anymore. I go into here, pick my drop down, do false, and now both of them have a font bold property that equals false. If you don't want to click each individual one and they're by each other, I click off here. I can hold down my left mouse button and I can drag a box around both of them and it will select them both just the same. Change bold back to true, and I'm ready to go. In addition to that, if I wanted a third label and I didn't want to have to keep going in and setting these individual properties, I can select one of these controls, right click, copy, select an empty space, right click, and paste. And it will create an exact copy of the first one. But just as these two labels are unique and distinct, so is this one. There's no connection that would make this one all of a sudden have to change everything that the first one did. In fact, to illustrate that, I'm going to change the text property of this label to label 3. And you'll notice the first one, even though we copied from it, is unaffected by it. Now, I decided that when I start this up, hitting F5 again, I don't like this label 2 and label 3 on here. I think that if I'm writing a program for a user, they're not going to really like that either. It doesn't make any sense. So what I'm going to do is I want to clear out this text, but I still want the label to be there. So clicking on label 2 and the text property, I can go in here and I can delete all of the text that's in that property for that label and hit enter, and you'll see that it looks like it's gone. But if you recall, we can drag a box around where that label is and you'll see it's selected again. And I can go in and I can say back to label 2. So even though I've gone and I've deleted all of the text, all of the letters that are part of that text property, I still have the label there. But this is sort of a pain, right? Because I have to kind of guess where it is, and if I'm over here it's not there, and it's not here, and it's not there. But okay, yeah, now I finally found it. It's a little tedious. And you'll see that once it's selected, over here in my properties window, you can see that it says label 2. If I click on Hello World, that changes to label 1. Click on label 3, and that changes to label 3. And what is going on here is that each label has a unique name. They can't all share the same name because then Visual Studio wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Remember, they're each objects, and everything inside of our program that is an object is completely independent and unique from another one. And that even means that its name must be unique as well. And in fact, we're going to find out that that's how you access a particular control when you're writing code, is by its name. Sometimes it'll be referred to as its ID. And so really what we want to do is we want to start remembering what it is that each of these controls is named as. And now if I can't remember where I put the control, I can go into my properties window, and you'll see up here on the top there's a little drop down button, and I can select that, and this will show you all of the controls that are on your form by the name of it. And we'll see if I pick label 1, it will select label 1 on the form. Label 2 will select the middle one. And lastly, and surprisingly, label 3 will select the last one. But this gets to be a little tedious, right? Because what if we had 20 labels? You're not going to remember which label is label 13 versus label 17. So we have to come down with a better way of organizing our stuff. Good programs are all about organizing, and it probably sounds a little boring at first, but it lets you concentrate on the more interesting part later, which is writing the code. So we have to do a little house cleaning right off the bat, and it will pay off. And so this brings us into something that we call a naming convention. A naming convention is sort of a unsigned contract that developers use, that they say, okay, well, I know that when I'm going to put a label on, I'm going to call it something very specific, so that there's no confusion on what it is that I'm actually talking about. And the most important thing, and there are multiple naming conventions and people get into fistfights over them, I'm sure, is that you're consistent throughout your own program. There are certain naming conventions that people can argue are better than another, but the most important thing you do is that you're consistent, which means do it the same way every time. And so this is our naming convention. We're going to start with Hello World. Now, it already has a name. It has a name of label 1, and that's because we dragged it onto our form from our toolbox. And by default means the behavior that it's going to do if we don't tell it to do anything different. By default, it's going to call it label 1 because it's a label and it was the first one that we dragged onto our form. The second one's called label 2, and sure enough, this one's called label 3. But we can change that. It's not set in stone. And that is in the name property. Now, even though my properties are organized alphabetically here, the name property will show up first because it's the most important. It's what makes this one unique. So I can click in here. And the first thing you can't do is name it the same thing as another label. If I were to call this label 2, it gives me an error message. Property value is not valid. You're going to get the same error if you don't type anything in there. If you get this and you don't know what it's about, you'll see there's a details button and it says empty identifiers are not valid. That means we didn't give it a name. If I tried to call it label 2 and click details, it says the label 2 is already in use by another component. That means that one's already taken. They have to be unique. So what we're going to call it is we're going to start out, and this is what we call all of our labels, we start out with the letters LBL. It's 3 letters, it's an abbreviation of label, and then what we need to do is we need to pick a name that sort of tells us what it is that that control is doing. We need to be able to have a name that says, oh, okay, I see what you're calling it. I know exactly which one it is. Because you're not always going to have this form in front of you. You're going to be writing code, and you're not going to be able to easily switch back and forth. And you don't want to. You want to just be able to keep writing your code. So in this case, we're going to make it real easy on ourselves, and we're going to say, well, what is it that the label's doing? In this case, the label is displaying the letters Hello World. So we're going to call this one label Hello World. Now, as part of the naming convention, the first 3 letters are all lowercase, and then the first letter of each word is capitalized. We call this Camel Case. So LBL, capital H, ELLO, capital W, ORLD. We call it Camel Case because the first letters are lowercase and then we have the capital letters up that. So to visualize it, we stretch it out a little bit. We say this is our head and these are the camel's humps. So I can do something like this. Whoops. So we have our camel here, here's his tail, and then those are his humps, and then maybe his legs here. So we got this camel. So the lowercase starts out with it, that's his head, and then capital letters on each one. Now usually you're not going to have more than 2 or 3 words in it. The idea is that you keep it short and you can see what's going on. And I promise I'll take some art classes so we can better visualize that. There's his eye. So remember Camel Case. And the reason we do it is that those capital letters, being part of each word, makes that sort of pop out so it's easier to read for us. So let's go down the line and take care of our other ones. Going into this drop down, I can select label 2, and we're going to call this one LBL Greeting. We're going to use this one to display a greeting message. And then let's have this one say LBL blank for now, because we're not going to have it say anything. Because it's blank, we called it label blank, we probably should have it actually be blank. If I load up my program, you'll see the middle one's missing, and the last one still has that text on there. Now, we saw that if I select that label, and I go into here, and I delete all of that text, it makes it almost invisible. There's no text in there. But I don't like that. I think that's too easy. I want to try something maybe a little newer. So what I'm going to do, instead of having it say label 3 though, is I don't really like that I can't see where it is anymore once I delete it. But I don't like it saying label 3 anymore either, because that's not what it's called. So again, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to type LBL blank. And this might not be what I have display, but at least it reminds me of what that label is. It's not going to say anything in the beginning, but I want to give it some text so I know what it is. I would call that, it has a placeholder value. Placeholder, I can see where its place is on my form. So if I can't clear this out, and I can, but again, I want to do something different, what other options do I have to change the appearance of what my program is? Again, look at it, I fire it up, it's there. I want to get rid of it. Well, anything that we change through this properties window is also something that we can change through code. We would say we change it programmatically by doing some programming. So now we're ready to actually go ahead and write some code. But before we do that, we have to sort of talk about what happens when the user interacts with our form, with our application. The way that this works is when our form loads up the first time, it sends a bunch of messages back to the application that something has happened. We say an event occurred, something special, something that's worth talking about. In this case, because we don't have anything else on here, the event that takes place is called the form load. The form has finished loading and now it's actually ready for the user to do something with. The form load will actually take place right before, oh, I closed my application down. The form load will take place right before we see it. So it gives us a last chance to change anything that the user might see. And so that's where we want to write our code. We want our code to happen right before the user sees it, because then what we can do is we can hide this label right here. Now, the way Visual Studio and the designer works is that just about anything interesting that you'd want to work with on your code is going to be accessible through a double click. Make sure you're not over a label. We're going to select our form in any place where it's empty, and we're going to double click with our mouse. And now, for the first time, we actually get to see some code. Everything you see here is C# code. Now, don't get overwhelmed. It's a lot of stuff that we don't really know what it is yet, but that's okay. And to some extent, that's part of programming, is there are some things that you just don't touch. It's not the worst thing in the world if you do. You have the potential of maybe breaking something. If you break something, then all that means is that your code and your application won't run. For example, you'll see that there are a lot of curly braces, and if you click on them, you'll notice that they will highlight themselves in gray, and they'll do it in a pair. So these two are a pair. If I click here, these two are a pair. If I click this one, and this one are a pair. Every curly brace needs to have a matching set. It's very important. If it doesn't, and I were to say accidentally delete one, and I hit F5, you're going to get this. And you're going to be very familiar with this message. It says, there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? I will often say no. It's going to ask you every time. We don't want to know the last time it ran. We want to fix what went wrong. So I'm going to check, do not show this dialog again, and then I say no. Now, depending on what our code error is, sometimes Visual Studio can help us out. On the bottom, sure enough, it says curly bracket expected. It'll tell us the file, which almost always is going to be our form, and then it's also going to show us the line number and possibly the column. So if I click on this, it's going to take me to where it thinks there's a message. And what we really want is we want to put our curly brace here so there's a matching set. But what's also nice is that if we just bumped the keyboard, possibly we can undo the damage that we just did. And to undo something in Visual Studio is just like in Office. We hold down the Control key and we press Z. And it goes back quite a ways depending on the changes that you made, and usually you can fix these kind of errors with doing a Control Z. Now if I hit F5, it will build and it will work. What else do we have here? In the beginning of the form, we have all of these words called using. And we'll be learning more about this later in the semester, but these are all the things that the application will need to build. We would say that these are libraries, we say these are namespaces. What's important is that you don't remove any of these and that you don't go in and try and change any of them. Even changing something like removing a Y or maybe making it all capital letters is going to be enough to break it. When you break something, you're going to get these angry red squiggles under it, and that's how you know you broke something. Again, Control Z gets me back out, and I'm ready to code again. We have this namespace. Namespace has an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. This is something that needs to be, we would say it's wrapped around our code, right? It has a starting brace and an end brace at the beginning and end. It's wrapped around our code. That's something that our application needs in order to run. Same thing with this, public partial class here. What happened when we double-clicked our form is that Visual Studio generated this code for us. It pasted this in here for us. This is the code that we want, and this is the code that will execute when the form loads the first time. We call this block of code from here down to the closing curly brace, the matching set, we call this a function. A function is a block of code that will execute as a group. When I say it executes, I mean that when you write a line of code, the computer will interpret what you meant by it and do the according action depending on what it is you wrote. So anything that we want to write, we want to put in between the start curly brace and the end curly brace. Well, what is it that we want to do? Well, when we talk about changing the text property of something, what do? We go in, if that's not open already, we say properties, we scroll down and we go into the text property and we change the letters in this box. So what we're going to do with code is not that different from that. If you recall, we gave that label a name. We gave it LBL blank as the name. So when we want to do something in code, the first thing we have to do is tell our program what it is we're going to be working with. What object do we want to affect? Do we want to change the property of? So we called it LBL blank. I'm going to type LBL blank. And the minute you touch that first L, a menu is going to pop up. We call this IntelliSense. IntelliSense helps you write code. For the most part, once you get very good at it, it will save you a lot of time. It'll save you a lot of sore fingers because it's able to sort of guess what it is that you want to do. And because we named all of our labels LBL, if I type LBL again, it already knows that we want to work with one of our labels. And this is a reason for having naming conventions, is Visual Studio and the IntelliSense will help you out. Now, there are a couple different ways you can do this. You can take your mouse, and we want LBL blank, and you can just double click and it will select it for you. You can also use your arrow keys up and down, and once the correct one is selected, hit your tab key and it will auto-complete. Now, we know we wanted to work with LBL blank. We know that we want to work with the text property. So the next thing we have to do is actually access the text property in here. And the way you do that through code is you say period or dot. Dot is a way of saying has. We say LBL blank has a text property. That's what we're interested in. And sure enough, once we hit the dot, we see all of these. And if you were to go back into your designer and look at all of the properties available, you'd see that most of them are in here. The one that we want is text. And if you scroll down, there it is. And we can double click and that will autocomplete. If you don't like using your mouse, you can say dot, T-E-X-T, and it will show up, and hit tab, and there it is. You can also just type the whole thing out. What's important though, and this is very important inside of C#, is that you get the capitalization correct. And all of these properties start with a capital letter. So if you were to type this out exactly, you have to type it with a capital T. Now, we're still getting that angry red underline. It's because we have some more work to do. Now, inside of Visual Studio Designer, we clicked into that text box and we wrote whatever text we wanted. There's a special way of writing text inside of code in order for the compiler, in order for Visual Studio to be able to understand what it is that you mean. And that is, when you are setting a property, you have to use the equal sign. The equal sign is telling the compiler that you want to change this property. It's sort of like in high school math class when you're figuring out equations and you say x equals 6 or y equals 27. That's the same thing. We have .text and we want to store or say that that property equals something. In our case, and let's just use some test text, let's have it say C#. And to do so, we have to put it in quotes. Quotes is the way of letting the compiler know that we're not writing code, we're writing something special, and it's actually text, it's actually words. So in this case, I'm going to type quote, the letters C, and let's spell out sharp. And then, this is important, a closing quote. Just like we need to have opening and closing curly braces, we need to have opening and closing quotes. That lets it know that everything between those quotes, that's the word that we want. Now we're almost done. Just like in a book, at the end of a sentence you have a period. Well, at the end of a sentence in C#, we need a semicolon. And that is the way of us telling the compiler that this piece of code is done, that this is an entire sentence, or in our case, this is an entire line of code, and it's ready to go. So what are we going to see? Well, this code here, all of it, is what executes when the form finishes loading. So this code will load up, it's going to execute this line, and it should take whatever's in that label and set it to be C#. If I hit F5 and I run it, sure enough, there we go. It's not very glamorous. There's no sparkles or anything going off. In fact, most of it happens before the program even starts showing itself to us. But it still happened, because look, it says C# here, but on our form, it still says LBL blank. So something is happening, which is great. But if you recall, what I wanted was for this to be blank. So just like in our properties, when we want to have it be a blank, we delete all the words, we delete all the letters. Same thing here. I delete everything between the opening and closing string, and now it's blank. We call this an empty string. And it basically means nothing is being shown. You would do this to clear out something that you're displaying to the user. So now we have really our first program where something is happening dynamically. Dynamic means change. And we're doing it through code. And we're changing something that runs while the program is firing up while it's loading for the first time. But let's do something a little more interesting. That's great that we have something that can actually load on the form the first time. But I want to do something that happens as a result of something I'm doing as the user. And the best thing for that is a button. And buttons are for clicking. So what I think I want instead is when this button is clicked, I want one of my blank labels to say goodbye. The first thing I want to do is this button kind of looks out of place with my other text. So I want to change it so that it doesn't just say button 1. And again, if I were to drag another button on the form, it would be called button 2. A third one would be button 3. So that's the default name that it gives the button. So the first thing we got to do is we got to give it a different name. We don't like button 1. You can see over here in the properties that that's what it's called. So scrolling up in our properties window, in the name, I'm going to call this one BTN Goodbye. Capital G, lowercase b. Next, I'm going to change what the button says. Just like changing what the label says, it's the same property. In this case, it's text. I'm going to have it say goodbye, and that changed the text on the button. I also want to change the font size so it looks like the rest of our form. Change that to 14, and I'll change the bold to true. Now you'll see that now we can't see all of the text because the text was too big for the button and it got clipped off, it got cropped. Grabbing one of the handles, I'm going to drag it out until I can see the whole thing. And now we have a little bit more of a consistency in our program. Now what I want to do is when this button gets clicked, I want to change one of my labels to say goodbye. Just like we put that code on our form load, I can also put code that will execute when a button is clicked. If you recall, I said anytime something interesting happens, when it's about a control, we can usually get at it through a double click of that control. Now before we do that though, I want you to look at this code here. We have this here, frm hello world, and then we have this here where it says hello world load. Those are the two functions that we have. Now, going on my button and double clicking, it took us back into the code, and you'll see now we have a btn goodbye click. It generated that code for us. It wrote that for us on our form so that all we have to do is go in and put the line of code that we want to happen. Now, the code that we want to change right here is going to be our LBL greeting. That's where I want to display the message. That's our name, and that's what we can use in our code to be able to access that label. So now, typing this out, LBL, IntelliSense will help us out. I'm going to use my arrow key to select greeting, tab, and we want to change the text property. Dot, TEX, takes me to text, tab key again will complete it for us. You don't have to use IntelliSense. If you'd like to just type it all out, sometimes that's faster. It's really up to you on how you want to work. Space equals, and now any text that we want to have it show up, we have to put in between quotes. And often what I'll do is I'll do my opening quote, my closing quote, and then my semicolon. And what that will do is it gets rid of all of those red lines for me so that I'm not getting any more error messages. And then I'll go back and I'll actually write whatever it is I want in between the quotes, and I don't have to worry about syntax and stuff like that. So what we wanted it to say was goodbye. So we type that out, make sure there's no error messages, and we're ready to go. Hitting F5 will build it, and now you'll see it's cleared out. It doesn't say goodbye because that code is going to execute on this here. It says button goodbye click. That's when this button gets clicked. This code executed because that occurred on the form load. The load is what happened the first time the application started up. So now, going over my button and clicking it, you'll see that sure enough, it says goodbye. We dynamically change the text of that label on the button click event. Events are what happens when something interesting occurs in our application. Now usually that's going to be when the user did something. And I want you to stop and think about the next time you use a program. When you click a button, when you click into a text box, what happens? Those are all events that are triggered by something you did as a user. So this is our first real program where we're doing something dynamically, where we caused something to occur. It wasn't just static values on the form. And what we'll be covering in the next lecture is really taking everything that we've done so far and making sure that we've gone through and we've done it correctly. Because part of writing code is getting things to happen, but the other important part is making sure that we're doing it right and that we're leaving ourselves a good way to build off of it in the future.